Hello and welcome to the book conversation series that's part of the United States and the World Workshop at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Our guest today is Priya Satia. Dr. Satia is the Raymond A. Spruance Professor of International History and a Professor of History at Stanford University. She is the author of Empire of Guns, The Violent Making of the Industrial Revolution, which won several prizes, including the American Historical Association's Jerry Bentley Prize. Her first book, Spies in Arabia, The Great War and the Cultural Foundations of Britain's Covert Empire in the Middle East, also won multiple prizes, including the AHA's Herbert Baxter Adams Prize. Her academic and popular writing has appeared in the American Historical Review, Technology and Culture, Financial Times, Slate, The Nation, among many others. And her latest book, Times Monster, History, Conscience, and Britain's Empire, published by Harvard University Press in 2020, is the book that we'll be focusing on today. Welcome, Dr. Satya.
Thank you, Professor Khalil, for having me.
It's great to have you. This is really, I'm going to hold up a copy of your book again. I loved reading your book. It's so rich. And one of the things I often say as much as I can to anybody who ever asks, and I said it here when you visited us, your writing is so inspiring because it makes us, I believe it makes me, and I think it makes many other historians want to be better writers. And what I loved about this book is that it actually really challenges us to be better and more thoughtful historians. So I wanted to thank you for writing it. And it's so rich, and there's so many points to jump off on and discuss. But I mean, the first one that I think struck me was how did this come to you? I mean, this is your third book, and how did the idea for this book really come to you? And what was the origin point?
I think all throughout the time I've been a historian, I have been wrestling with. Can you hear me? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I, I've been wrestling with the question of conscience in the British Empire, so that's been a continuous preoccupation. And after my last book, which was about this Quaker gunmaker, and I was in that book exploring how a Quaker could be a gunmaker. Um, I just sort of had this epiphany about him and the explanations that he gave for, to justify what he was doing. And I realized that he was making an argument about history. So what he says is that, yes, as a Quaker, I shouldn't be making guns. But in the moment in the situation in which Providence has placed us, I have no other choice. So my previous book was, about the Industrial Revolution and, how he can help us understand that. But afterwards, I started thinking, well, what does he mean when he's saying Providence has constrained him in some way? And I realized he was making an argument about history. He's not saying God is making me make guns or that he doesn't think there's anything wrong with making guns. I mean, he says that a little bit too. But his main point was that, look, we're in this moment where the economy around me is a military industrial one, and that's the result. That's historically produced, and so I can't do anything but go along with history. Like my hands are tied by history, and there's a confidence that this is ultimately going to lead to a better place. That history is going to be a narrative of progress. And this Quaker gunmaker, I mean, his name is Samuel Galton, but he's not just an industrialist. He's also an Enlightenment figure. And so what he's saying, as I delved into it deeper, was echoing what some of his friends who were Enlightenment thinkers, who were philosophizing about history, also that was what the kinds of arguments they were also making about history. And that made me think, okay, well, there's a story we can tell about the modern period in which historical thinking becomes a kind of ethical idiom that helps to basically enable a lot of the troubling events of the modern period. And so this book sort of tells a story about how, in so many instances, you have actually historians in prominent positions of decision making in the story of the British Empire, where they're justifying, they're saying, well, I know what I'm doing right now violates my dearly held ethical principles, even my religious beliefs, but I know that history is going to vindicate me.
And I think it's such a wonderful aspect of the book one, as a historian to read it, but that it's also accessible for others who are not historians to come in and get a better understanding of the role of history and of historians. And as you mentioned, you've talked about Galston, and I think what's so great about your second book is this idea of refocusing the history of the Industrial Revolution through war, and Galston. And then, of course, your first book, which looked at the role of British scholar spies. And so I'm wondering how, in your mind, this book connects to those first two books. Does it, in a way? I mean, you've already touched on one aspect of this, but how does it also connect to spies in Arabia, at least in your own mind?
Yeah, so that was my first book, and it was about these, uh, British self-avowed experts on the Middle East. And what I realized after I started thinking about the Galton story in this new way was that even these were people in the 20th century, even those 20th century Middle East experts who were the architects of the British Empire in the Middle East, were actually, many of them were historians, and including archaeologists. And so I realized that I've kind of always been studying historians without realizing it. And in that case too, as and I talk about this in my new book as well, um, there were arguments that these figures were making about history in justifying the kinds of actions they were taking in the Middle East. And I specifically go into their design of this very violent system of imperial policing called air control. And the argument they made was that the Middle East is not even on the timeline of the story of history that we tell as a story of progress. So we need to bring it into the real world. It is on a mythical, biblical timeline, and the ethics there are also of that kind. And so you can do things there that wouldn't be acceptable in the secular real world. But the point of doing them is to bring the Middle East into the real world so that it can then have progress like the rest of the world. So that is covered in one chapter of the book as well.
So you have this wonderfully evocative title for the book. So what is Time's Monster as you tell it?
So what I'm referring to, the monster that I'm talking about, is this historical ethical idiom that says you have to sometimes sacrifice your morals in the present and trust in future vindication of acts that are self-evidently morally questionable in the present. And the reason I think that idea became monstrous is because it was invented, as a means of cultivating virtue in people, especially young men of a certain class in the 18th century, with such good intentions, right? But just like Frankenstein's monster, which is a book that comes out of this very period, it exceeds the control of those who created it with those good intentions and winds up enabling all kinds of harmful activity. And so it's in that sense that I'm playing on the Frankenstein title and considering that ethical idiom that's based on historical thinking as sort of a monster that got out of our control.
I think that's wonderful. It struck me, the title, and as I was reading the book, one of our recent presidents, who was a history major, George W. Bush, and when he was asked about how history would judge, for example, the war in Iraq, and he was quite blunt, and he said, history, we don't know, we'll all be dead. And so, and it was kind of such a non-reflective response for someone who was a history major. And it struck me that, he encapsulated in some ways, where this story would end if you were to carry it through into the United States. And I thought it was one of the things I really wanted to ask you about was when I was reading the book, and especially because you write here that essentializing representations of other places and peoples laid the cultural foundations of empire, but historical thinking empowered Britons to act on them. And so, again, taking us back to the George W. Bush quote and what you've written, it struck me that even though this is a book clearly about the British Empire, it's also about the United States as an empire. And I'm wondering if you saw, as you were writing this, uh, that the United States not just inherits this mantle of empire from Great Britain, and it was often very specific about that, but also sees itself as a unique historical actor. And I'm wondering if you agree with that, and how much of that also inspired some of your research and writing on this book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this culture, though it emerges in Europe, even from that moment, I mean, that's the moment in which the United States is being made, right? And the actions of the revolutionaries. I mean, I have this epigraph in the book, which is a line taken from the Hamilton musical, where Washington tells Hamilton, history has its eyes on you. I mean, this is an Enlightenment idea, and the Enlightenment ideas are transatlantic ideas. So definitely, I think that culture has shaped American history and American imperialism, both internally in terms of the expansion of the United States within North America, but also overseas imperialism, right up to the present. It's definitely, a phenomenon, a kind of outlook that's British, but also, I think, partly because of the British, it spread so much. I mean, a lot of it's like liberal thinking, right? It's liberalism, and that's kind of a universal legacy that we all have to kind of get out of the habit of thinking that way, I think. So yeah, and positioned as I am in the US, I mean, I'm living and working in California. I'm involved in conversations about the role of historians in American public debate as much as I'm watching, what's going on in the UK as well. Definitely, this book is as much about what the historical discipline needs to, how we need to reflect on our own history for the sake of U.S. conversations as much as in Europe or anywhere else.
So I thought if we could, you know, dig into the book, and I want to come back to towards the end, especially some of these questions for historians to think about, and the field of history, um, and we're kind of using your book as a jumping off point for that. And so, my favorite chapter was chapter 3, which examines the relationship between race and empire. And you write that in the mid 19th century, events in Afghanistan and India challenged, quote, the liberal assumption of universal capacity to attain British civilization. So what happened, and what were the implications?
Yeah, so for the first half of the 19th century, you can say, I mean, there's always more than one idea, but sort of one dominant idea in the British approach to colonialism in South Asia was um, reform, right? And kind of liberal empire, right? So the idea that um, we're trying to bring civilization everywhere. It's a civilizing mission. What does civilization look like? Well, it's British civilization, and but the goal here is universalistic. It assumes that anyone can attain that kind of civilization. It's just a question of educating and reforming people. But there's no racial barrier to becoming basically British, even though that entire outlook is, of course, implicitly racist in that it is in its assumption of British civilization as the only worthy kind of civilization, and this idea that different peoples are at different moments of history and need help to kind of attain that. But still, there is this kind of universalistic goal, and there's the idea that anyone can become British this way. And there are these massive rebellions against British rule in the middle of the 19th century, and one of the biggest ones is this rebellion in India in 1857. And it's actually on the scale of a war, and it takes a whole year for the British to suppress it, and they resort to quite brutal means to do so. But in the background, at the same time, new ideas about race are emerging. This is when you start to get, in the second half of the 19th century, scientific racism that's based on a kind of perversion of Darwinian science. And basically, there are these new ideas, especially after this this rebellion that the British really didn't see coming, where they say, well, maybe we were just pushing too hard and being too generous in thinking that Indians could become like us. Obviously, they don't appreciate what it means to be British if they're pushing back against it. And so, yeah, there are actually racial barriers to who can become British. And that's why even in the Caribbean colonies where people have had and where slavery has been abolished since the 1830s, we haven't seen dramatic improvement in the lives of Black people. That's because Black people have limits grounded in race, and so there's this sort of giving up on that universalist goal of liberal empire, but it doesn't go away entirely. And for some people, it's sort of like, well, now we just need to think that the horizon of the story is way further out, and we'll have to be here as imperial rulers for much, much, much longer. But eventually, we will have a story of progress. So some people sort of reconcile that idea of the possibility of an identical historical trajectory with the impossibility, given racial barriers, by just pushing the timeline out beyond what they can imagine, and sort of coping with it that way.
And it struck me again, and to bring it back to kind of the American empire, it struck me, in the aftermath during the Iraq War, especially as the insurgency picked up, some of the advocates for the Iraq War drew a similar line of thinking. There was this idea that Fuad Ajami, writes this book called The Foreigner's Gift, and basically it's all about how freedom was given to the Iraqis, but they rejected it, and they turned on us. We were so generous to give this to them, and they didn't know how to respond. And it struck me how much of this was so rooted in so much of this earlier discourse, and for almost a very similar rationale. And so I found the parallels and these connections so interesting and so deep that in almost every page and every example that you bring up, and I really think it's such a wonderful book. And to that, and I think this is again something that you do so well, is that you make this very important point about Britain's imperial project. You write that there were no monsters. Liberals, as much as conservatives, believed in the legitimacy of empire. So how was that reproduced in scholarship and then also used to ensure popular support, both not just at the elite level, but among the general public?
So I think, what you start to see happening in the late 19th century is that there is this totally unapologetic kind of jingoistic form of imperialism in Britain, where people are saying, well, we don't need to justify, we don't need to have a civilizing mission. It's okay to just conquer other parts of the world because we can, and because it brings us some advantage, economic, political, what have you. So there's that kind of jingoistic, unapologetic imperialism. And there are liberals who are critical of that, who are saying, well, no, we're causing famine in this part of the world, or we're not uplifting people, or, this particular governor behaved really badly. And so they're kind of calling out the scandals of empire. And that line about when I say there are no monsters is to point out that, okay, even though there are some people who are critical of certain goings on in the British Empire, they don't fundamentally question imperialism itself, and the legitimacy of it. They still think empire is something worth doing. They just dispute whether or not there should be a justification. They still feel there should be a moral justification to it, and they don't think that the British should commit certain kinds of excesses in the course of being imperial rulers. But they don't ever question Britain's imperial prerogative, let's put it that way. And I think you see a legacy of that in the scholarship that has, dates from that era on. You can think of someone like a critic of empire of that era like John Hobson, right? And even today, you find people who are saying, well, there are pros and there are cons to empire. We can't just dismiss all of empire as having been a bad thing. We need to weigh the pros and cons. And I think that's a legacy of that sort of turn of the century liberal way of thinking about empire. when in fact, in the 20th century, in the period of decolonization, anti-colonial thinkers and activists really won the argument that empire is a fundamentally racist and violent and exploitative form of rule, and it is not legitimate. And yet, in the last, 50 years, we continue to, sort of forget that, and you still see these attempts to defend imperialism or some aspects of it.
Well, and I think it's fascinating because to me it seems to occur, and I'm wondering if you agree with this on two levels. One, you have kind of this imperial nostalgia that occurs in Britain, and you also have an attempt to justify American empire in much the same way. Um, and do you see those as connected? Do you see, especially particularly, is there a political connection? Is it because of kind of the 1980s Thatcherite Reagan coalition of conservatism that led to this kind of imperial nostalgia?
Yeah, I think it goes back even further. I think there's definitely sort of a passing of the baton, or a sharing of the baton, in World War II. And then immediately after that, the Cold War begins. And I think there's definitely a sense that the British and the United States are partnering, um, to carry on the white man's burden of guiding the rest of the world in the right direction, and now against this new threat of Bolshevism, or the Soviet Union, and what it represents. So definitely, I think that that's a shared culture, and I think you're right that in the Reagan Thatcher era, it gets more kind of explicitly nurtured and cultivated and celebrated. And then you see in the, as you mentioned, the war on Iraq, it's, Tony Blair is gung ho, and the British are America's best friends. And so it's very much, I think, you can even think of earlier events like, the coup in Iran in 1953, which is a joint British US operation, where they definitely feel they have common interests and a common culture, and common outlook.
So part of, on the one hand, you mentioned the role of imperial nostalgia, but there's also this real challenging of, as you've mentioned, empire and empire's impact. And you talk a lot about, for example, the actual how much debt there should be to India, for example, in the book, that that Britain actually owes to India. And so I was really struck through the book when you talked about kind of the response, the subaltern response, right, to empire and to this imperial knowledge. And I thought it was great that you worked that into as part of this challenge. But you also warn that there is an issue with this type of kind of the redemptive idea of history, and so and it works in both ways. So there's this idea of history as redemption, as presented by those who are attempting to kind of write about empire uh, from the metropole, as well as those from the colony. Do you want to explore that a little bit?
Yeah, so the book makes this argument that partly because of the pressure of anti-colonial thought and activity in the 20th century, you see historians starting to reconsider the way they've written the history of empire. And so by the 1950s, you have this a very different idea of the ethical purpose of history. It's not about um, it's not about narrating the story of progress. It's about um, searching in the past for lost ways of life, redeeming them for their own sake, so that we can learn them and even apply them in new ways in our present. And E.P. Thompson is a figure that's really associated with this. And it's also a shift in who we write about. So if great men were the makers of history up until that point, there's a new focus on history from below. And the Subaltern Studies Collective, who work on South Asian history, um, and are sort of the South Asian branch of this new methodology, this new approach to history. Um, they also, find new ways of writing about Indian history in the period of colonialism that sort of talk back to the imperial archive. And so there's a sort of shift in the political positioning of history. It's all about truth telling against those in power. It's about criticizing empire rather than abetting empire. Um, but that's not to say that the old way of writing about history and the history of empire goes away. It remains, especially when there's stories anchored to around great men biographies. I mean, those are just so compelling that they remain popular, especially in popular history. Whereas in the scholarly world, history definitely goes down this other path of like history from below, um, redemptive narratives, questioning narratives about great men and things like that. So there's sort of this rift, within the discipline, and I think we're still, dealing with that rift, where there are some people who remain committed to that old kind of Victorian way of thinking about history, including, today the Prime Minister of the UK. Um, Boris Johnson, who fancies himself a historian, and Churchill, he's written a biography of Churchill and so on. Um, and those in the academy who think much more critically, and would say that our role is much more to criticize a government and empower the public to question government as well, and have that role in public debate and public affairs.
So I was struck also uh, when we think about the response of the subaltern response, if you will, that they also tie into, and I'm using a broad they here, but that the stories also adopt this redemptive arc, which and you warn against that this is actually that there's a risk here in adopting this redemptive arc, in telling kind of the counter history of empire. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I mean, the only things that I find worrying in that approach to history is, one, I think we still struggle to think about the role of religion in history, even within this kind of revisionist approach to history. I don't think the E.P. Thompson mode of history ever really succeeded in understanding that part of human life. Um, and I think sometimes, insofar as this way of doing history was still instrumentalist, right? And in its hope to find in lost causes in the past, uses in the present. It still kind of has an instrumentalist approach, and it's still, there's a lingering commitment to, or a wishful longing still for a story of progress. And I think, at some level, you need hope. You need a utopian vision to be able to feel motivated to do anything, um, and be any kind of activist or political participant in your own time. But when the risk is only in deferring that as something that's going to happen in the future, because then you wind up again in this position of, well, how much should I sacrifice the present for the sake of the future? So, the Gandhian answer to that was, well, you should never sacrifice the present for the future. You can be free right now, always. All you have to do is not cooperate with those who would um, take away your freedom. So that's the nonviolent resistance, or the non-cooperation, or passive resistance, whatever you want to call it. And he's not alone in thinking this way. He's borrowing a lot from Tolstoy and earlier thinkers, even British thinkers, even William Blake. Um, I mean, there's a kind of global lineage to these ideas, and ever since, as I said, it's in the 18th century that this historical ethical idiom emerges. But right in that, from that moment on to our present, there have always been those dissenting against it, and many times they do draw on religious ideas as alternative understandings of ethics to push back against that historical idiom. And so again, dealing with religion as historians it becomes sort of a big uh, challenge and something that's really urgently necessary.
Well, and that's a great segue to this part of the book, which is in chapter 5. You have this excellent discussion of partition as it was applied in three parts of the British Empire, so Ireland, Palestine, and in India. And you write that the British saw religion, like other identities, as a fixed, mutually exclusive badge of identity, despite its often fluid and locally determined nature. How did that fixed application and really this constructed notion, right, contribute to the violence that eventually occurs, whether it's in Palestine or in India? And how did the British authorities and scholars attempt to direct responsibility for that violence?
Yes, and many of the places that the British ruled, they the whole there's an impulse to sort of order society in a way to make it legible because these are completely foreign places to them. And so they try to fix all kinds of identities in much more permanent ways than people live out their different aspects of their identity. So notions, whether it's a social identity like caste or a religious identity, these things are kind of built into state bureaucracies and administration in a new way in the 19th to 20th centuries. So when you see these conflicts that seem to be based on religion in places formerly ruled by the British in the 20th century, there is a sort of habitual, oh, these are ancient hatreds between the Hindus and Muslims that have never gotten along, or the Jews and the Muslims in Palestine have never gotten along, or Catholics and Protestants in Ireland have never gotten along. But actually, those are all three places that were governed by the British, in which religious identity was built into political structures in a new way, given new meaning. You had to sort of choose in a binary way, I'm this or that, and choosing meant, so like in Britain they were separate, in India, in British India, there were separate electorates for Hindus and Muslims from the early 20th century. And then once you're glad as an Indian that, oh, I have some political power now. I can vote in a local election, but there's a cost to it. I can only vote with my fellow Hindus for a Hindu. Well, let me organize a political party now. Well, I guess that's going to be a whole an entirely Hindu political party, and the parallel thing going on in the for Muslims. And so you have an entire political life that's organized around religion in a new way. And so that's going to create some kind of clash at some point. And so it does in the late 1930s, and really during World War II. It's really in that um, pressure cooker of the war that this the rift between Hindus and Muslims, and this idea that they are different communities and require different national spaces, I think really gains traction. And it's a complicated story of who gets locked up and who doesn't during the war. But I think there are parallels. You can think about other places that where you see very similar dynamics, and I think that in itself is very good evidence that these are actually very modern conflicts shaped by the colonial experience, and not at all about ancient hatreds. And there's plenty of evidence that these communities have at other times been able to live together, not without any friction at all, but can live together with relative harmony or peace, varying across time and place.
And I think you do a wonderful job of showing that when the violence erupts, that so much of this comes back to, in the mid 20th century, comes back to many of the similar kind of British justifications from the mid 19th, right? So we need to be here, right, to maintain the peace. And so it becomes almost a self-justifying. What we told you that if we weren't here, they were just going to start killing each other. And so, but ignoring completely how they had set in motion and had helped to stoke much of these issues, and of course, doing very little to clamp down the violence. Do you want to talk a little about that, about this issue of violence and the kind of the imperial origins of it?
Yeah, sure. So when the British first arrive in India, I mean, one way that they justify their intrusion is by saying, well, there was a Mughal empire here first, and they're foreigners and invaders, even though the Mughal empire is very different. It's totally indigenized by the time, especially that the British get there. It's a very different kind of polity. But one way that the British justify their presence in South Asia is by saying we're rescuing the Hindus from Muslim invaders. So they already set up this narrative of Muslims being foreigners, and this dynamic that's going to lead to sort of ever increasing alienation between these two communities. It's divide and rule, and it was called out as such by people in that time, and even the British officials at different times, described it as precisely that we're dividing these communities to prevent them from uniting against us, as they did, for instance, in the 1857 rebellion. So all their policies are um, designed to avoid that kind of unified uh, pressure against the British presence. And so they very much encourage an antagonistic dynamic between these groups. And then because they've already made up the story of of them as the sort of saviors of this um, of one community against the other, then it becomes very easy to argue that, well, we can never leave because if we leave, they'll be at odds again. And look, we are leaving now because you're making us. And look, they are at odds again. This is what we said would happen. And so they can completely abdicate all responsibility
Yeah.
for their role in creating and exacerbating and feeding those antagonisms the entire time they were there.
And I think one of the other things you point out is also, this, the creation of local militias, the arming of certain militias, other populations are not, and it's a template that is applied across the empire in so many ways. Do you want to talk about kind of the role of scholars here in kind of reifying these imperial categories a little bit as you
You mean today or in the time?
at that time period, and then we can come back to today too.
Yeah, I mean, these different kinds of, yeah, I mean, there's, if we think about the discipline of anthropology, its history is um, was completely shaped by this um, era of colonialism and the study of different ethnicities and different religious groups and different castes within all these formerly colonized parts of the world. I mean, all of that was scholarship that was um, encouraged by the colonial state. In many cases, it was people working for the colonial state. And I think anthropologists, the discipline of anthropology today has done a much better job of sort of um, excavating those origins, dealing with it, reinventing the discipline so that it can go forward in different ways. And I think what I wanted to, help do with this book was to encourage our discipline, historians to look at the role that we have had in empire, and which I think has been, maybe it was just so hiding in such plain sight that it was a little bit harder to see. And we just take it for granted that Winston Churchill was the prime minister and also a really popular historian. But if you stop and think about that, it's not just an interesting piece of trivia. There's something really important there that we haven't kind of dealt with, and so that's what I tried to do.
I think that's a great point. I mean, and I think your point's really well taken. That anthropology, I think, has attempted to deal with its colonial roots. History has not. Political science certainly hasn't. And they, it's really remarkable that we've, the social sciences have often seen, and in part because they emphasize this aspect of social science, that they are somehow, immune from bias, right? When it's so deeply embedded in the study, especially when we come to what we now consider area studies, but for the British in the colonies, or for the U.S. and basically the rest of the world. So taking that, you write, and I think this is really important, that connection back to Ireland, India, and Palestine, which is that partition remains a favored solution, and that this is the product of the continuing intellectual and moral grip of an imperial historical imagination that sees partition as the logical way of paternalistically bringing order to a disordered world. So How has this continued to manifest? And is it only, as you put it, a historical imagination, or is it also historical amnesia? I'm curious if you think are they mutually exclusive, or do you think they're connected in that way?
No, they're similar. I mean, it's both. It's both. So by historical imagination, I mean this idea that there's going to be um, that the sort of story of history is one of progress, and that um, there's supposed to be a sort of utopic order at the end, and that where places are messy, the way to advance history and bring order is to divide them and put them, certain people in certain geographical spaces and separated from other people, and that is sort of the forward movement of history, rather than an incredibly tragic denial of past bonds and coexistence, right? And when I say it's historical amnesia, also it's because the continued belief that this is ever going to work depends on amnesia about the fact that every time it's been tried, it has failed. When has partition ever worked? I mean, if you think about South Asia, that's now a nuclear armed conflict zone. Kashmir remains an unresolved part of that effort to partition South Asia into these two states, and then it was three states with Bangladesh as well. And you think about, Israel Palestine, again, ongoing dilemma, what to do. You think about Cyprus, you think about even something like Korea, which is not a British case, but I mean, again, partition has never solved a problem, and yet whether it's something like the Sudan and Syria, places that are seeing turmoil, and then international bodies like the UN, they immediately start saying, well, the solution is going to be partition, right? Or if it's something like Brexit, where the idea is, division from the European continent is going to solve all our problems. I mean, that's all based on this amnesia about, when did division ever help anything? I mean, it's hard to think of an example.
I'm curious if, as you're seeing it, as you're looking at this from the British Empire's perspective, how did historians play a role in the partition debates?
Well, it's definitely historians who kind of put the idea in circulation in the first place. So in the book, I talk about this figure, Reginald Coupland, who's an academic historian. He holds a chair and White professor, and he really believes that federation is what the empire is all about. It's what it does. Through federation, Britain itself was born, with Scotland, Wales, and England coming together. And that this is a phase of history that every area needs to go through. And so, in these troubled parts of the world, you need to create these federal units that will then come together and get over their differences, and then they'll reunify later on. And in this scheme, he could not imagine what's happening today in Britain, where Scotland wants independence. I mean, that should be over by now in this vision. So it's people like that who are thinking in terms of historical progress and what's going to happen in the future, that they're the ones who are putting this kind of idea of partition on the table, and it gains traction in official circles thanks to them. But then, these ideas circulate in different ways among colonized people themselves, who have different reasons for committing to them. And so I talk about that a little bit in the book as well, where some people are just trying to get out of the nation state, or trying to think of alternatives to organizing the world besides the nation state system, because they're seeing in the period of World War I and World War II that, wow, the nation state system is a very dangerous system. It causes a lot of rivalry, competition, it's destructive. You get these massive total wars. Is there some other way of thinking of organizing the world? And so they're coming to the idea of, possible federal structures for South Asia, from that objective. And so what you see is sort of a collision between these two, and a kind of, you get the worst possible outcome, in a sense, in the way these two ways of thinking about partition come together in the end.
So this is a great transition to present day. And even though we didn't try to talk about that in both. So, admirably, you address the question of what is the historian's place in history today. And you note that policy relevant research by historians is often willfully ignored by policymakers because it's often critical. Right? This the Iraq example is just one. And we face a very tenuous time in the profession, as you know. So we have the pandemic has created great uncertainty in the university. It builds on a decade or more of declining enrollments in the humanities and social sciences, and a very difficult academic job market that will severely limit, if not eliminate, the careers of future historians. So I'm curious, how do you see the future of history as a profession, and what lessons can we draw from your book?
Well, I definitely think, this is partly a very protective book about the discipline, and that, at least that's how it was intended, to say being critics of power is, that's a really important role to have, and it's the right role for historians. So this was to push back against those who are nostalgic for a time when historians were in the corridors of power. I mean, of course, we want policymakers to be educated and know history. We don't want them. We don't want to not have historically trained people in power. But I think for professional historians, our job is to educate the public and to question what those in power do. And that is a really important and really powerful role. And I think rather though, so if we no longer want to promote the idea that that as a nation or as an empire, we have a particular historical agenda to take the world in a certain direction. We don't want that understanding of a historian's role. What we do want is to help people understand how we got to our present circumstances, where we're dealing with the legacies of empire, we're dealing with the legacies of industrial capitalism, especially in the form of climate change. We need history to understand how we got here so that we can come up with just and equitable solutions to those problems. And I think historians are people who, not just as scholars in universities, but as people who, are whether we're journalists or whether we are working in museums, in all these kinds of public spaces, can be participating in conversations about how the past shaped the present. So whether that's conversations about, Black Lives Matter or memorialization, or what museums should do with their collections, or whether there should be apologies about past events or restitution of looted artifacts and things like that. Those are all ways in which we can make the future different depending on how we act now, but we need to be informed by what the past was like in order to make those decisions in the present. And so there's a lot of public work for historians to do, not only as professors sitting in universities. And it's just the whole humanistic kind of purpose of history is so important to nurture and cherish and bear in mind, whether it's being able to think critically and to understand the difference between an opinion and a fact, those kinds of skills, and whether it's just studying history and the past to commune with people from a different time and place, because that enhances your self-understanding. The idea of studying history for the purpose of self-discovery, that's really important to promote as well. It's so important to just being human, to engage in those kinds of practices.
So, and I think that's a wonderful point. And it leads me to really our final question, which is, you've been a prolific public intellectual and applying your research on the British Empire to current debates and issues here in the U.S. And you recently wrote a piece on then nominee and now Vice President-elect Kamala Harris in Time magazine, and you placed her biography in the broader history of Allied global struggles for equality. And you write that this is not surprising, as the forces of inequality, capitalism, imperialism, and slavery, are themselves global too. And so why do you think both aspects of the story are so conveniently overlooked? And what does that say about, um, when we think about of a more humanistic understanding, but also our own historical understanding and our understanding of historical processes, how we study them, how we teach them. I'm curious if there's something that we should be rethinking as historians and as to offer a broader and more interconnected understanding of these past processes.
Yeah, certainly. I think sometimes it's easier to miss these well, like you're saying, this article is about the kind of the global influences, the global strands of history that had to come together for us to get Kamala Harris as a vice president elect. And I think sometimes those dynamics are harder to miss if you're only thinking of history and learning history and teaching history in national frameworks. Um, so because I'm a historian of empire, I mean, I'm already forced to think outside the box of the nation. And so that made it easier for me maybe to spot those connections than, let's say, an American historian, right? And so I think that doesn't mean we should have no US history, no national history. It's just that they should be porous. The way we divide up the discipline, because you have to organize it somehow, but you can organize it regionally, maybe more than nationally, and then also create thematic ways of organizing the discipline, and trans-regional ways of thinking about it, so that we don't blind ourselves to those those connections between different subfields of the discipline. And no part of the world has evolved in isolation, right? Especially in the modern period, because colonialism and and capitalism have been such forces that have transcended space so much. And we really need to pay attention to the way things have change has occurred in a way that transcends space. And I think that will only help us today and create, again, more kinds of future possibilities, you know, um, and less chance of, it's a way of pushing again back against sort of isolationist, provincial thinking, America first kind of thinking, Brexit kind of thinking today.
I think it struck me and the timepiece when we think about Barack Obama and Harris and in a way their story is, as you point out, it's a story of both colonialism and America's Cold War, as well as the decolonization struggles, as well as the civil rights movement, and them coming together. And in so many ways, this was the and that's why it's also remarkable the backlash. We're seeing some of this the xenophobic backlash, whether to Obama or to Harris, where this was the image the United States wanted to present to the world during the Cold War. When you think about their parents, right? So it was come to the University of California in Berkeley, at Berkeley, and get educated and get your PhD, and either stay here or go back and build your society in our image. Barack Obama's mom or his father, and so it's remarkable, perhaps not so, to see kind of these questions about their Americanness that has come through when they are very much an American story that was told during the Cold War, that this is what we wanted. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, it's just it's the tragedy of the American right. Um, you know, no non-white person is ever going to be American enough to a certain segment of the population.
But this also takes us to your book, because this was, in a sense, that moment you describe in the mid 19th century, where this shift from that there was a possibility for universal British citizenship, and then all of a sudden it was like, well, okay, well, maybe not, right? That you're never quite.
Yeah,
I mean, do you see that connection as well, or is this?
yeah, it's racism, it's white supremacism. I mean, if you want to, we can characterize, when I say the new race science and the idea of permanent racial difference in the late 19th century, that's that kind of white supremacism. That's the period of Jim Crow in this country too, right? So the American history is not off the, it's on the same trajectory. And this was also a country engaged in an imperial project, both internally and externally. And so, yeah, when I say there are legacies of empire that we need to deal with, one of them is that it seems permanent, that legacy of racism, but you can't think of it that way. You have to just remain invested in the struggle against it. Um, Therein lies freedom from it, right? So, yeah.
Well, I think that's a great point to end on. Dr. Priya Satia, thank you so much for this wonderful book, Time's Monster, which I'll hold up the cover again, and for all of your writing, both your books and your op-eds. It's really very inspiring. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me on this talk and for inviting me again. It's always good to see you.